What if a single person could decisively change the course of the history of an entire country? That's exactly what we're talking about today. But before we dive in, I have a question for you. Was Otto von Bismarck more of a hero who united Germany or a power-conscious politician who pushed through his goals with a hard hand and a clever strategy? Be sure to write your opinion in the comments below. There is no clear right or wrong here, and that's exactly what makes this topic so exciting. In this video, we take you on a journey through the life of one of Europe's most influential statesmen. It is about power, diplomacy, war, and the emergence of a new Germany. You'll see how a man of extraordinary political acumen managed to unite a fractured country and make history. If you are fascinated by such stories and want to learn more about formative personalities and turning points in history, then support the channel with a like and subscribe to it so that you don't miss any more videos. And now let's start with the story of Otto von Bismarck, and the question of how much influence a single person can really have. Chapter 1. Introduction. Who was Otto von Bismarck? When talking about the origins of Germany, one name almost inevitably comes up: Otto von Bismarck. But who was this man really? Was he a brilliant strategist who united a fragmented country with foresight and political skill? Or was he a cold power politician who consciously accepted wars in order to achieve his goals? The answer is not easy, and that's exactly where the fascination of his story lies. Bismarck was born in 1815, at a time when Germany was not yet a unified state. Instead, the area consisted of many individual principalities, kingdoms, and free cities that were loosely organized in the German Confederation. This political fragmentation meant that Germany had less influence compared to other major European powers, such as France or Great Britain. Bismarck grew up in this complex world, and it was precisely these circumstances that were to shape him later. It became clear early on that Bismarck would not become an ordinary politician. He was known for his strong will, his direct manner, and his ability to see through situations quickly. At the same time, however, he was also a man full of contradictions. On the one hand, conservative and loyal to the Prussian king; on the other hand, willing to take unconventional paths to achieve his goals. This mixture made him a unique figure in 19th-century European politics. What particularly distinguished Bismarck was his understanding of power. For him, it wasn't just about ideals or political theories. It was about achieving concrete results. In this context, his statement that the big questions of the time would not be decided by speeches and majority decisions, but by iron and blood became famous. This sentence has often been interpreted as an expression of toughness and readiness for war, but above all it shows how realistically, some would say uncompromisingly, Bismarck viewed the political world. To really understand Bismarck, you also have to put yourself in his time. Europe was in a state of upheaval. The ideas of the French Revolution had spread new ideas of freedom, nation, and democracy. At the same time, many monarchies struggled to maintain their power. In Germany, the desire for unity grew, but there were different ideas about what this unity should look like. Should a democratic nation-state emerge, or an empire led by Prussia? It was precisely in this area of tension that Bismarck moved. As a politician, he was not a visionary in the classical sense. He did not dream of an ideal world, but worked with the conditions he found. His strength lay in recognizing opportunities and taking them decisively. In doing so, he relied on both diplomacy and military strength, depending on what brought him the greatest advantage at the time. This pragmatic approach made him one of the most successful, but also most controversial politicians of his time. Another important aspect of Bismarck's personality was his ability to influence people. He knew exactly how he came across to others and used it purposefully. Whether in conversation with kings, generals, or foreign diplomats, Bismarck knew how to assert his position without always being openly confrontational. He often worked in the background, pulling the strings and making others believe that they had made the decisions. This subtle way of exercising power was a decisive factor in his success. But Bismarck was not only a political tactician. He was also a person with personal convictions, fears, and doubts. His letters and notes show that he was well aware of the risks of his actions. He knew that his policies brought not only opportunities, but also dangers. Nevertheless, he was willing to take these risks, convinced that his path was the right one. His greatest goal, which drove him for many years, was the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. He pursued this goal with a consistency that is impressive. In doing so, he skillfully exploited the political tensions in Europe and managed to play his opponents off against each other. Step by step, he approached his goal, and in the process changed not only Germany, but the entire European power structure. But as great as his successes were, they came at a price. The wars that led to German unification cost many lives. Bismarck's course was also not without controversy in domestic politics. His measures against political opponents and his attempts to shape society according to his ideas repeatedly led to conflicts. These dark sides are just as much a part of his legacy as his successes. To this day, Bismarck is assessed differently. For some, he is the Iron Chancellor who united Germany and made it a great power. For others, it is a symbol of authoritarian politics and power thinking. Both perspectives have their justification, and that's exactly why it's worth taking a closer look. In this script, we will go through Bismarck's life step by step. We will see how a young man from the Prussian nobility became one of the most powerful politicians in Europe. We will understand his decisions, understand his strategies, and also look at the consequences of his actions. This is not only about historical facts, but also about the question of what we can learn from its history today. Because the topics that Bismarck dealt with are still relevant today: power, politics, national identity, and the question of how far one can go to achieve one's goals. His story is not only a look into the past, but also a mirror for the present. In the end, the central question remains: was Bismarck a brilliant architect of German unity or an unscrupulous power politician? While we deal with his life in the following chapters, you may be able to form your own opinion. And that's exactly what makes history so exciting. It doesn't provide simple answers, but invites you to think and question for yourself. Chapter 2: Childhood and Origin. To understand how Otto von Bismarck was able to become one of Europe's most influential politicians, it is worth taking a closer look at his origins and childhood. As with many historical personalities, the roots of their later decisions are often hidden deep in the early years of life. Otto Eduard Leopold von Bismarck was born on April 1, 1815 on the Skonhausen estate on the Elbe, a rural town in the Altmark, which at the time belonged to the Kingdom of Prussia. His family came from the Prussian nobility, more precisely the so-called Junker class. This social class was characterized by large landholdings, military tradition, and a deep-rooted loyalty to the Prussian royal family. Bismarck's life path was marked out in a certain way by this background alone. A sense of duty, conservative values, and a strong sense of class were part of his everyday life long before he consciously became involved in politics. His father, Karl Wilhelm Ferdinand von Bismarck, was a typical representative of the landed gentry. He led a rather quiet life as a landowner, had little political ambition, and embodied the traditional values of his class. His mother, Wilhelmine Mencken, on the other hand, came from a middle-class family with an academic background. Her father was a high-ranking civil servant, and she herself was educated, ambitious, and strongly interested in ensuring that her children received a good education and advanced in society. This combination of conservative landed gentry and enlightened bourgeoisie shaped Bismarck in a special way. It became apparent early on that Bismarck stood between these two worlds. On the one hand, the quiet, almost sedate world of his father, characterized by tradition and consistency. On the other hand, the ambitious, performance-oriented attitude of his mother, who attached great importance to education and career. These contrasts often led to tensions within the family, and Bismarck himself often felt torn. He spent most of his childhood in the countryside, surrounded by fields, forests, and the rather simple way of life of the rural population. This time had a lasting impact on him. He developed a close connection to nature, but also an understanding of the social structures of rural life. At the same time, he learned early on what it meant to be part of a privileged class. The difference between nobility and ordinary people was omnipresent and was not questioned, It was simply reality. But his mother had other plans for him. She wanted Otto to become more than just a landowner. Therefore, the family moved to Berlin for a time so that he could receive a better school education. For the young Bismarck, this meant an abrupt change, from a free, natural life in the countryside to the strict structures of a big city and a sophisticated education system. In Berlin, he attended various schools, including the renowned Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium. The lessons were strict, disciplined, and strongly influenced by classical subjects such as Latin and history. Bismarck was not a bad student, but he was not a particularly diligent one either. Rather, he stood out for his strong character. He was self-confident, sometimes even stubborn, and did not like to be forced into strict rules. These qualities brought him not only recognition, but also conflicts with teachers and classmates. From an early age, a trait became apparent that was to accompany him throughout his life: the urge to go his own way. He was not willing to simply adapt, but questioned things and often acted impulsively. At the same time, he possessed a remarkable intelligence and perceptiveness, which enabled him to achieve good performance even without much diligence. Another formative factor of his youth was the feeling of being uprooted. He neither felt completely at home in the world of the nobility in the countryside, nor did he fully identify with the educated bourgeoisie of the city. This inner conflict led him to learn to move in different social environments at an early age, a skill that would later be of great use to him in politics. His relationship with his parents also played an important role. While he had a rather distant but respectful attitude towards his father, the relationship with his mother was more complicated. She had high expectations of him, urged him to perform and achieve social success. Bismarck, on the other hand, often felt this as pressure and reacted with resistance. These tensions contributed to the fact that he developed a certain emotional independence at an early age. In addition to school and family life, the political and social circumstances of his time also shaped his youth. After the Napoleonic Wars, Europe was in a phase of reorganization. The Congress of Vienna had tried to restore the old balance of power, but the ideas of freedom and national unity could no longer be pushed out of people's minds. Although Bismarck was not fully aware of these developments as a teenager, they formed the background to his later political career. It is also interesting that Bismarck did not stand out as a future statesman in his youth. On the contrary, many would probably have described him as a restless, stubborn young man who did not yet know exactly which path he would take. He himself initially showed little interest in a classic political career. Rather, it seemed as if he was moving disoriented between his family's expectations and his own inclinations. But it was precisely this phase of uncertainty that was decisive. It gave him the opportunity to get to know different perspectives and to develop a deep understanding of the complexity of society and politics. Unlike many of his later contemporaries, Bismarck was not fixed from the beginning. He had to find his way first, and that's what ultimately made him so adaptable and strategic. His origins in the Prussian nobility gave him a strong sense of hierarchy, order, and state authority. At the same time, his mother's influence brought him into contact with education, ambition, and a certain degree of openness to new ideas. This combination of tradition and willingness to change became a central element of his personality. Looking back, it can be said that Bismarck's childhood and background laid the foundation for everything that was to follow later. The values he learned in his family, the experiences between the countryside and the city, the tensions between duty and personal freedom, all this shaped his character and prepared him for his later role. So if we want to understand why Bismarck acted the way he did, then we have to start right here. In the early years of a boy who grew up between two worlds and learned to find his way in both. For it was out of this field of tension that the special mixture of toughness, intelligence, and political instinct developed that would later make him one of the most influential figures in European history. Chapter 3: Studies and Early Career. After the formative years of his childhood and school days, Otto von Bismarck began a new phase of his life, which initially gave little indication that he would one day change the political landscape of Europe. Like many young men from aristocratic families, he took a classic educational path. But here, too, it quickly became clear that Bismarck was no ordinary student. In 1832, he began his law studies at the University of Göttingen. This decision was less an expression of a personal passion than a consequence of social expectations. A legal education was considered a solid foundation for a later career in the civil service, a path that was considered appropriate and honorable for members of his class. But instead of devoting himself exclusively to his studies, Bismarck threw himself into student life with great enthusiasm. Göttingen was known for its lively student culture, characterized by debates, conviviality, and last but not least, the notorious duels. Bismarck joined the Corps Hanovra, a student fraternity that attached great importance to honor, cohesion, and courage. These values corresponded to his nature and were very well received by him. The duels, also called Mensuren, were an integral part of the everyday life of many student fraternities. It was less about defeating the opponent and more about proving steadfastness and strength of character. Bismarck took part in several such duels and suffered some scars, which he later presented with a certain pride. They were considered a sign of courage and masculinity, qualities that were highly respected in society at the time. His studies themselves were rather unconventional. Although Bismarck had a quick grasp and a good memory, he often lacked the discipline for continuous learning. Instead of dealing intensively with legal theories, he preferred to deal with practical questions of life, political discussions, and social contacts. Nevertheless, he managed to pass the necessary exams, a testament to his intellectual abilities, but also to his ability to focus on what mattered when it mattered. After a few semesters, he transferred to the University of Berlin, where he continued his studies. Berlin was not only the capital of Prussia, but also a center of political and intellectual activity. Here Bismarck came into closer contact with the political currents of his time. The ideas of liberalism, nationalism, and reforms have been intensively debated in academic circles. But while many of his contemporaries were enthusiastic about these ideas, Bismarck remained skeptical. He was rather distant from the liberal movements and increasingly developed a conservative attitude. For him, the existing order, with a strong state and a clear hierarchy, was a guarantor of stability. In his opinion, change should not come about through revolutionary upheavals, but through controlled political decisions. This basic attitude was later to become a central element of his policy. After completing his studies, Bismarck entered the Prussian civil service. He began his career as a trainee lawyer, a kind of legal trainee, and worked in various administrative positions. He first worked in Aachen, later in Potsdam. This period was characterized by routine, bureaucracy, and clear hierarchies, exactly what was expected of a career in the civil service. But Bismarck felt increasingly uncomfortable in this role. The work was too monotonous for him, the structures too rigid. He had difficulty fitting into the strict rules and procedures, and repeatedly came into conflict with his superiors. His independent character and direct manner made it difficult for him to subordinate himself. For someone like Bismarck, who liked to think and act independently, the civil service was not very satisfying in the long run. In addition, at that time he was not yet clear about which path he really wanted to take. The expectations of his family and society were often at odds with his own ideas. He was looking for a job that offered him not only security, but also personal fulfillment, and didn't find it at first. A turning point in this phase of his life was the death of his mother in 1839. This event had a deep impact on him. On the one hand, it removed an important driving force in his life, someone who had always spurred him on to achievement and ambition. On the other hand, a new opportunity opened up for him. He could concentrate more on life on the family estates. In the following years, Bismarck largely withdrew from the civil service and took over the administration of the family's estates, especially in Pomerania. This period is often referred to as his Landjunkers phase. He lived a comparatively quiet life, occupied himself with agriculture, administration, and social life in the countryside. At the same time, he developed a stronger understanding of economic interrelationships and the reality of life for the rural population. But even if this phase did not seem very spectacular on the outside, It was of great importance for Bismarck's development. Here he had the opportunity to take on responsibility, make decisions, and gain practical experience. He learned how to deal with people, how to solve conflicts, and the importance of thinking long-term. Skills that would later benefit him in politics. It was also during this time that he began to deal more intensively with political issues. Although he was not yet actively involved in politics, he closely followed developments in Prussia and Europe. The tensions between conservative and liberal forces, the discussions about reforms, and the growing importance of national movements, all this increasingly aroused his interest. His conservative attitude continued to consolidate. He developed the conviction that a strong state was necessary to ensure order and stability. At the same time, he realized that politics was not only about principles, but also about power, strategy, and the ability to compromise. These insights formed the basis for his later political philosophy. In retrospect, it can be said that Bismarck's student days and early career were characterized less by spectacular successes than by personal development. He tried things out, failed due to certain expectations, and finally found his own way. It was precisely these detours that made him the politician he later became. He was not a classic careerist who single-mindedly pursued a career. Rather, it developed step by step, shaped by experiences, doubts, and new insights. His time as a student taught him the importance of social networks and personal relationships. His work in the civil service showed him the limits of bureaucratic structures. And his years in the countryside gave him a deep understanding of practical realities of life. All these experiences later flowed into his political work. They made him a politician who not only thought theoretically, but also acted practically. He knew how people function, how power is exercised, and how to achieve goals without getting lost in ideologies. So this chapter does not end with a major breakthrough, but with an important insight. The path to becoming the Iron Chancellor did not begin in the highest political offices, but in the seemingly unspectacular years of learning, searching, and growing. It was here that Bismarck laid the foundation for everything that was to come. Chapter 4: Political Advancement. Otto von Bismarck's path into big politics did not begin with a sudden breakthrough, but developed step by step, marked by crises, upheavals, and personal decisions. In particular, the events around 1848 were to play a decisive role in this and turn the previously rather reclusive landowner into a convinced political actor. After Bismarck had spent a few years on the family estates, he became increasingly interested in political issues. His conservative attitude was now consolidated, and he closely followed developments in the Kingdom of Prussia and the German Confederation. Tensions between liberal reform movements and the existing monarchical order continued to rise, a conflict that finally reached its climax in the revolutions of 1848. These revolutions shook all of Europe. In the German states, too, people took to the streets, demanding more co-determination, freedom of the press, and the unity of Germany. In cities like Berlin, barricade fights broke out, and many saw these events as the beginning of a new, more democratic era. For Bismarck, however, these developments posed a threat. He viewed the revolutionary movements with great skepticism, even rejection. For him, they did not mean progress, but chaos and the possible collapse of the existing order. His loyalty was to the Prussian king and the traditional structure of the state. In this situation, he made a conscious decision to become politically active, not to drive change, but to control it and steer it in his favor. His first significant political step came in 1847, when he entered the United Parliament as a representative of the nobility. This body was a kind of forerunner of a parliament, but with severely limited rights. It was here that Bismarck appeared in public for the first time as a speaker, and immediately made an impression. His speeches were clear, direct, and often provocative. While many of his contemporaries tried to find compromises, Bismarck consistently advocated conservative positions. He spoke out against liberal reforms and defended the power of the king. In doing so, he did not shy away from openly representing unpopular opinions. This attitude earned him both criticism and attention. What distinguished Bismarck from the beginning was his ability to quickly analyze political situations and act strategically. He understood that politics consisted not only of ideals, but above all of power relations. While others were still discussing, he was already thinking about how to gain influence and guide decisions. The Revolution of 1848 was a kind of test for him. While many conservative forces were initially unsure how to react, Bismarck positioned himself clearly. He supported the monarchy and spoke out strongly against revolutionary changes. At the same time, however, he also recognized that political realities had changed. The demand for national unity could not simply be ignored. A particularly important event of this time was the Frankfurt National Assembly, which met in 1848 in St. Paul's Church. Their goal was to draw up a constitution for a united Germany. For many, this was a historic moment, the chance to create a German nation-state for the first time. Bismarck, however, was critical of this project. He doubted that a parliamentarily led nation-state would be stable. Instead, he favored a solution under Prussian leadership, in which the monarchy played a central role. This idea clearly distinguished him from the liberal forces that were striving for a democratic constitution. Already here a basic principle of his later policy becomes apparent. Unity, yes, but under a clear power structure and not through revolutionary processes. After the failure of the revolutions, a more conservative order returned to many parts of Europe. The situation in Prussia also stabilized, and Bismarck was able to further expand his political influence. In 1849 he was elected to the Prussian State Parliament, where he further consolidated his position. During this time, his reputation as an uncompromising representative of conservative interests also developed. But at the same time, he began to refine his strategy. He realized that rigid rejection of change was not always expedient. Instead, he learned to react flexibly and use political developments to his advantage. An important step in his rise was his appointment as Prussia's envoy to the German Confederation in Frankfurt in 1851. This position brought him onto the stage of international diplomacy for the first time. Here he had the opportunity not only to represent Prussian interests, but also to get to know the political structures of the German Confederation at close quarters. In Frankfurt, he met representatives of various German states, in particular the delegates of Austria, which at that time played a leading role in the German Confederation. Bismarck quickly realized that Prussia and Austria were in a competitive relationship. Both powers claimed influence in Germany, a conflict that would later play a central role in German unification. His time in Frankfurt was of great importance to Bismarck. He learned how diplomacy works at the highest level, how to negotiate, forge alliances, and assess political opponents. At the same time, he developed an increasingly clear understanding that the future of Germany would not be decided by discussions in Parliament, but by power politics. This realization marks a decisive turning point in his development. The conservative politician increasingly became a strategic thinker who was willing to break new ground in order to achieve his goals. In doing so, he remained true to his basic convictions, but adapted his methods to the respective circumstances. Another important aspect of his rise was his ability to gain the trust of the political leadership. He made a special impression on the Prussian royal family with his loyalty and clear attitude. He was increasingly perceived as someone who not only convinced, but also acted. In the following years, this rise continued. Bismarck was appointed to various diplomatic positions, including as envoy to Russia and later to France. These stations broadened his horizons considerably. He got to know the major European powers at close quarters and developed a feeling for international contexts. But despite all these experiences, one goal always remained present in the background: the strengthening of Prussia and the reorganization of Germany. Bismarck began to understand that this goal would not be achieved by chance, but through targeted political decisions, and if necessary, through conflict. At the end of this chapter, Bismarck is not yet at the top of power, but he is well on his way there. The young, impetuous student has become an experienced politician who understands the rules of power and is ready to use them. His political rise is thus an example of how conviction, experience, and strategic thinking can lead to an extraordinary career. At the same time, he shows that major changes often do not happen suddenly, but are the result of a long process, a process that has only just begun with Bismarck. Chapter 5: Bismarck as a diplomat. The next decisive step in Otto von Bismarck's life finally led him to the big stage of European politics. While he had previously been politically active, especially within Prussia, a phase began in which he gained international experience, sharpened his strategic thinking, and developed a deep understanding of the balance of power in Europe. These years as a diplomat were to prepare him significantly for his later role as architect of German unity. In 1851, Bismarck was appointed Prussian envoy to the German Confederation in Frankfurt. This position was of central importance, because the German Confederation was the political alliance of the German states, and at the same time a place where the rivalry between Prussia and Austria was particularly evident. Austria traditionally played a leading role in the Confederation, while Prussia increasingly tried to expand its influence. For Bismarck, this task was a great challenge, but also an enormous opportunity. He entered a political stage in which not only national interests, but also personal relationships, diplomatic subtleties, and strategic considerations played a decisive role. Here he learned how politics worked beyond speeches and parliamentary debates, namely as a complex game of power, negotiation, and tactical skill. In Frankfurt, Bismarck closely observed how the representatives of the various German states acted. He was particularly impressed by the Austrian diplomats, not necessarily in a positive sense, but as serious opponents. He quickly realized that Austria would not voluntarily give up its supremacy in the German Confederation. At the same time, it became clear to him that Prussia could only take on a leading role in the long term if it was prepared to actively tackle this challenge. But instead of openly confronting Austria, Bismarck initially relied on observation and analysis. He studied the processes in the Bundestag, got to know the strengths and weaknesses of his political opponents, and developed a sense of when to act and when to wait. This ability for patience and strategic timing became one of his most important tools. Another important aspect of his time in Frankfurt was the expansion of personal networks. Bismarck understood early on that politics consisted not only of official negotiations, but also of informal conversations, relationships, and trust. He made contacts with diplomats from different countries, held behind-the-scenes talks, and took every opportunity to gather information. This also revealed one of his greatest strengths, his knowledge of human nature. Bismarck was able to quickly assess who he was dealing with, who was reliable, who was easily influenced, and who might pose a danger. This ability allowed him to adapt his strategies in a targeted manner and often gain a decisive advantage in negotiations. After several years in Frankfurt, Bismarck was sent to Russia as an envoy in 1859. This step marked a new phase in his diplomatic career. In St. Petersburg, he encountered a completely different political culture. The Russian Empire was an autocratic monarchy with its own traditions and power structures that differed markedly from those of Central Europe. For Bismarck, this was a valuable experience. He learned how differently political systems can function and developed an even broader understanding of international relations. It was particularly important for him to realize that each country pursues its own interests, and that successful diplomacy consists of recognizing these interests and skillfully combining them. In Russia, he also built up close relations with the Tsar's court. These contacts were to be of great importance later, especially in the conflicts that led to German unification. Bismarck understood that it was crucial to neutralize potential opponents, or at least win their support, before taking any major political steps. However, his time in Russia was not only characterized by political work. He also developed personally. He gained confidence, learned to move in an international environment, and cemented his reputation as a capable diplomat. At the same time, he remained true to himself, direct in his own way, sometimes even provocative, but always with a clear goal in mind. In 1862, he was finally appointed Prussian envoy to France, more precisely to Paris. This was a particularly delicate position, because France was one of the leading powers in Europe under Emperor Napoleon III. Relations between Prussia and France were characterized by mistrust, and the political situation was tense. In Paris, Bismarck was once again confronted with a new political reality. French politics was strongly influenced by the emperor's personal decisions, and diplomatic processes were often less formal than in other countries. Bismarck quickly adapted to these circumstances and used his experience from Frankfurt and Russia to operate successfully here as well. It was particularly important for him to develop a feeling for France's intentions. He closely observed how Napoleon III acted, what goals he pursued, and how he reacted to international developments. This information would later play a decisive role, especially in the run-up to the Franco-German War. During his time as a diplomat, Bismarck became increasingly aware that the future of Germany would not be decided by negotiations alone. While diplomacy was an important tool, it was ultimately about power, and the willingness to use that power. This realization led him to further develop his political ideas. He began to see diplomacy and military strength not as opposites, but as two sides of the same coin. For him, successful politics meant skillfully combining both elements. Negotiations could avoid or prepare for conflicts, but when necessary, one had to be prepared to act decisively. This attitude distinguished him from many of his contemporaries. While others relied on either diplomacy or military solutions, Bismarck combined the two into a comprehensive strategy. It was precisely this approach that would later become his trademark. Another important aspect of his diplomatic years was his ability to think long-term. Bismarck not only pursued short-term goals, but developed strategies that lasted for years. He planned ahead, took into account possible developments, and prepared for various scenarios. This foresight made him an extraordinary politician. At the same time, he remained flexible. If circumstances changed, he was willing to adjust his plans. For him, politics was not a rigid system, but a dynamic process that required constant adaptation. This combination of long-term planning and short-term flexibility was a decisive factor in its subsequent success. When Bismarck was finally recalled to Prussia in 1862, he had changed fundamentally. The once rather impulsive young politician had become an experienced diplomat who understood the mechanisms of international politics and knew how to use them to his advantage. He brought with him not only valuable contacts and experience, but also a clear idea of how the German question could be solved. His time in Frankfurt, Russia, and France had shown him that the unification of Germany was possible, but only under certain conditions and with a well-thought-out strategy. Bismarck was thus ready for the next step in his career. The stage was set, the experience was gained, and political tensions in Europe continued to rise. Everything indicated that a decisive phase was imminent, and Bismarck was exactly the man who would shape it. Chapter 6: Appointment as Prime Minister, 1862. When Otto von Bismarck returned to Prussia in 1862, the country was in a deep political crisis. The tensions between the government and parliament had reached a point where compromise seemed hardly possible. It was precisely the kind of situation in which Bismarck's skills as a power politician and strategist could unfold, and at the same time the moment that finally catapulted him into the center of power. At the heart of the crisis was a conflict over the reform of the Prussian army. King Wilhelm I was convinced that the military had to be modernized and strengthened in order to secure Prussia's position in Europe. To this end, the service hours were to be extended, the army enlarged, and the military structure reorganized. However, these reforms required significant financial resources, and this is where the problem began. The Prussian parliament, especially the liberal deputies, was not prepared to approve the demanded funds without further ado. They feared that a stronger army would further consolidate the king's power and weaken political participation. They also wanted to gain more influence over the control of the military. A political stalemate ensued. The king insisted on his reforms, Parliament refused to approve it, and neither side was willing to give in. In this tense situation, Wilhelm I looked for a solution. Several heads of government had previously failed to resolve the conflict. In the end, the choice fell on Bismarck, who had distinguished himself through his diplomatic experience, his loyalty to the monarchy and his determined manner. On September 23, 1862, he was appointed Prime Minister of Prussia. This appointment was anything but uncontroversial. Many saw Bismarck as a radical conservative who would exacerbate tensions rather than solve them. But that was exactly what convinced the king. Bismarck was prepared not only to endure the conflict, but to actively lead it. Shortly after taking office, Bismarck gave a speech that would later become one of the best-known political statements of the 19th century. In it, he explained that the big questions of the time would not be decided by speeches and majority decisions, but by iron and blood. This phrase has often been interpreted as an expression of militarism, but at its core it reflected Bismarck's fundamental conviction: politics is ultimately a question of power and assertiveness. With this attitude, Bismarck began to resolve the conflict with Parliament in his own way. Instead of seeking a compromise, he took advantage of a legal loophole in the Prussian constitution. Since neither the king nor Parliament could decide on their own how to deal with a budget dispute, Bismarck argued that the government simply had to continue to act in case of doubt, even without the consent of Parliament. In concrete terms, this meant that the army was reformed and the necessary funds were raised, although Parliament had not approved this. This step was extremely risky. It called into question the existing order and could easily have led to a political escalation. But Bismarck counted on the fact that the success of his policies would ultimately justify him. In the following years, he ruled de facto against Parliament. The liberal forces protested vehemently, accused him of violating the constitution, and tried to build up political pressure. But Bismarck remained steadfast. He ignored many of the attacks, consistently continued his policies, and focused on delivering results. What particularly distinguished him was his ability not only to endure conflicts, but to use them in a targeted manner. For him, the dispute with Parliament was not an obstacle, but a means to strengthen his position. By presenting himself as a determined defender of the state order, he won the support of conservative circles and strengthened the king's trust. At the same time, he began to make the army a central instrument of his politics. The reforms, which were so fiercely contested, proved to be decisive for the events to come. Bismarck knew that a strong military was necessary to achieve Prussia's goals, especially with regard to German unification. But despite his harshness, Bismarck was not a blind power politician. He did not act impulsively, but calculatedly. Each step was part of a larger strategy. He knew that he could not oppose Parliament in the long run without jeopardizing his position. That is why he relied on defusing domestic political conflicts through foreign policy successes. This strategy should prove to be extremely effective. By leading Prussia to military successes in the following years, he succeeded in changing public opinion in his favor. Many who had previously criticized him began to support his policies, or at least accept them. A decisive factor in this was his ability not only to fight political opponents, but also to integrate them. Bismarck was not an ideologue who strictly adhered to one line. If it benefited him, he was willing to compromise or adjust his position. This flexibility made him an extremely effective politician. His special strength was also evident in his dealings with the king. Bismarck knew how to convince Wilhelm I without openly dominating him. He presented his ideas in such a way that they appeared to be in the king's interest, and thus won his trust. At the same time, he himself retained control over the political strategy. This relationship between Bismarck and the king was crucial to his success. Without the support of Wilhelm I, he would not have been able to implement his policies. Conversely, the king benefited from Bismarck's determination and political skill. The years after 1862 were marked by intense political disputes, both domestically and internationally. But even in this early phase, it became clear that Bismarck was able to master even the most difficult situations. He combined determination with strategic thinking, toughness with flexibility, and a sense of power with political instinct. His appointment as Prime Minister was thus not only a personal success, but also a turning point in the history of Prussia. From now on, Political leadership was in the hands of a man who was willing to break new ground, even if it was risky. In retrospect, it becomes clear that it was precisely at this moment that the foundation for later German unity was laid. The reform of the army, the conflict with Parliament, and Bismarck's consistent policy created the conditions for the events to come. Without this phase, the further course of the story would hardly have been conceivable. But at the same time, the question remains whether the price was too high. Bismarck's approach called into question fundamental principles of political participation and set an example that power could also be placed above law if necessary. This ambivalence accompanied his entire career and made him one of the most controversial figures in history to this day. At the end of this chapter, Bismarck stands at the head of Prussia as prime minister, determined, strategically thinking, and ready to implement his vision. The stage is set, the conflicts are clear, and the next steps will change not only Prussia, but all of Europe. Chapter 7: The German-Danish War, 1864. When Otto von Bismarck took over as Prussian Prime Minister in 1862, he not only had domestic political conflicts to solve, but also a clear foreign policy vision. His long-term goal was to strengthen Prussia and reorganize Germany under Prussian leadership. But to achieve this goal, he had to proceed step by step, carefully, strategically, and with a keen sense of the European balance of power. The first major step on this path was the German-Danish War of 1864. At the center of this conflict were the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, two regions in northern Europe whose political affiliation had been disputed for decades. Holstein was part of the German Confederation, while Schleswig was more closely tied to the Kingdom of Denmark. At the same time, a mixed population of Germans and Danes lived in both areas, which further complicated the situation. The so-called Schleswig-Holstein question was considered one of Europe's most difficult diplomatic problems, so complex that even contemporaries said that only a few people really understood it. For Bismarck, however, this complicated situation was not a hurdle, but an opportunity. He recognized that this conflict could result in an advantage for Prussia if it was used skillfully. He was not primarily concerned with national ideals or the rights of the population, but with power politics. The question was not who was morally right, but how Prussia could be strengthened. The immediate trigger of the conflict was a political move by Denmark. In 1863, the Danish government passed a new constitution that was intended to bind Schleswig more closely to Denmark. This violated previous agreements and was seen as a provocation by many German states. Especially in the German Confederation, indignation grew, and pressure arose to take action against Denmark. Bismarck saw an opportunity in this. However, instead of taking immediate military action, he initially relied on diplomacy. His goal was not to make Prussia appear as an aggressive aggressor, but as a legitimate defender of German interests. At the same time, he wanted to prevent other major European powers, especially Great Britain, France, or Russia, from intervening in the conflict. A decisive move was the cooperation with Austria. Although Prussia and Austria were rivals in the German Confederation, Bismarck managed to win Austria as an ally. Together, the two powers took a stand against Denmark, officially in the name of the German Confederation, and to defend the rights in Schleswig and Holstein. This alliance was tactically motivated from the beginning. Bismarck had no intention of cooperating with Austria on a permanent basis. Rather, he used the opportunity to first take joint action against an external opponent and later to assert his own interests. This already shows a typical feature of his politics. Alliances were a means to an end for him, not long-term obligations. In February 1864, the war finally began. Prussian and Austrian troops marched into the disputed territories. Militarily, Denmark was clearly inferior to the two great powers, but the resistance was still to be taken seriously. The fortifications at Duppel in particular were an important obstacle. The Prussian army, which had previously been modernized by the controversial reforms, now played to its strengths. Under the leadership of experienced generals, it succeeded in systematically attacking the Danish positions. The Battle of the Duppel Redoubts in April 1864 became a decisive moment in the war. After intense fighting, The Prussian troops were able to take the Danish defenses, a military success that attracted a lot of attention. While the fighting continued, Bismarck remained active in the background. He ensured that the conflict remained limited and did not escalate into a major European war. His diplomatic skills were just as important as his military successes. He communicated with the other great powers, calmed their worries, and made sure that they did not intervene in the conflict. This already shows a central element of his strategy. War and diplomacy were inextricably linked for him. Military action served to achieve political goals, while diplomatic measures ensured that these actions did not get out of control. In the summer of 1864, the outcome of the war was practically decided. Denmark was forced to start peace negotiations. In October of the same year, the Peace of Vienna was finally concluded. Denmark had to cede the duchies of Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg to Prussia and Austria. At first glance, this seemed to be a joint success of the two powers. But for Bismarck, this was only an intermediate step. The real question now was, what should be done with the conquered territories? This is exactly where the next conflict began to emerge, this time not with Denmark, but with Austria. The administration of the duchies was initially divided between Prussia and Austria. But this solution was unstable from the start. Different interests, political tensions, and mutual mistrust led to cooperation becoming increasingly difficult. Bismarck had taken this into account. It was clear to him that the conflict with Austria would escalate sooner or later, and that is exactly what he wanted. The German-Danish War was thus much more than just a regional conflict. It was the first step in Bismarck's larger plan for German unification. Through the war, Prussia was able to demonstrate its military strength, expand its influence in the north, and at the same time create the basis for a later conflict with Austria. The war also had an important impact on domestic policy. The military successes strengthened Bismarck's position and helped to weaken criticism of his policies. Many who had previously opposed him because of his conflict with Parliament now began to recognize his results. Success on the battlefield legitimized his controversial decisions, so to speak. But as is so often the case in Bismarck's politics, this success also had its price. The war claimed victims, and the long-term consequences were not yet foreseeable. In addition, the question arose as to whether the path taken, the combination of military force and political strategy, would really lead to a stable order. For Bismarck himself, however, the German-Danish War was a clear success. He had shown that his strategy worked. Targeted conflicts, limited wars, and skillful diplomacy could be used to achieve political goals. He was to continue to apply this principle in the following years, with even more far-reaching consequences. At the end of this chapter, Prussia is stronger than before, Bismarck's position is consolidated, and the next steps are already emerging. The conflict with Denmark was only the beginning. The real challenge, and at the same time the decisive phase on the way to German unity, was yet to come. Chapter 8: The German War, 1866. After the success in the German-Danish War, Otto von Bismarck had taken an important step towards his great goal, the strengthening of Prussia within Germany. But the real opponent had been someone else from the beginning, Austria. The conflict between these two great powers was not new, but now it was coming to a head. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866 ultimately became the decisive turning point on the road to German unity. The tensions between Prussia and Austria had already built up during the joint administration of Schleswig and Holstein. After the victory over Denmark, the two duchies were divided between the two powers. Prussia administered Schleswig, Austria took over Holstein. What initially seemed like a pragmatic solution quickly developed into a political source of conflict. Bismarck had deliberately taken this development into account. It was clear to him that long-term cooperation with Austria was not possible if Prussia wanted to take on the leading role in Germany. So the conflict was not accidental, but part of a larger strategy. The aim was to oust Austria from internal German affairs, and to do so as quickly and decisively as possible. But a war against Austria was a risky undertaking. Austria was an established great power with a far-reaching sphere of influence. An ill-considered attack could easily have led to an international crisis. Therefore, Bismarck proceeded strategically as usual. Before he acted militarily, he secured Prussia's position diplomatically. A decisive step was the alliance with Italy. Italy had an interest of its own in weakening Austria, as it claimed Veneto, which was controlled by Austria. Bismarck cleverly exploited this situation and concluded an agreement. If a war broke out, Italy would attack Austria from the south. This forced Austria to fight on two fronts, a considerable disadvantage. At the same time, Bismarck ensured that other European powers remained neutral. Russia was sympathetic to Prussia, partly because of previous diplomatic relations. France under Napoleon III was put into a wait-and-see attitude by vague promises and clever communication. Britain, on the other hand, had no interest in direct interference. In this way, Bismarck isolated Austria diplomatically, a decisive step before the military conflict. The immediate trigger of the war was once again the Schleswig-Holstein question. Austria brought the administration of Holstein before the German Confederation and thus put Prussia under political pressure. Bismarck used this as an excuse to act militarily. In June 1866, Prussian troops marched into Holstein. Austria reacted by calling on the German Confederation to mobilize against Prussia. War had thus become inevitable. The Austro-Prussian War, often referred to as the Prussian-Austrian War, began in the summer of 1866. Unlike previous conflicts, it was short-lived, but of enormous importance. Within a few weeks, a decision was to be made as to who would take over the political leadership in Germany in the future. Prussia's military strength at this time was not a coincidence, but the result of the reforms that Bismarck had pushed through despite all resistance. The army was modernized, better organized, and technically superior. In particular, the needle rifle, a new weapon technology, gave the Prussian troops a decisive advantage on the battlefield. But it wasn't just the equipment that was crucial. Strategy also played a major role. Under the leadership of General Helmuth von Moltke, the Prussian army relied on rapid movements, coordinated attacks, and the use of modern means of communication such as the railway and the telegraph. This combination of technology and planning made Prussia an extremely effective military power. The decisive battle of the war took place on July 3, 1866 near Königgrätz, in today's Czech Republic. This is where the main Prussian and Austrian armies met. The battle was intense and costly, but in the end Prussia clearly prevailed. The victory at Königgrätz was not only a military success, but also a political signal. The balance of power in Germany had changed fundamentally. Austria was defeated and forced to enter into peace negotiations. But now another decisive characteristic of Bismarck became apparent: his ability to moderate at the right moment. Although Prussia was militarily superior and many demanded a harsh punishment of Austria, Bismarck advocated a comparatively mild peace. He knew that too harsh a treatment of Austria could have negative consequences in the long term. His goal was not the complete destruction of Austria, but its exclusion from German politics. A humiliated Austria might have sought revenge or formed new alliances. However, Bismarck wanted to create a stable state in which Prussia could take the lead unchallenged. In the Treaty of Prague, concluded in August 1866, this was exactly what was achieved. Austria had to leave the German Confederation and accept that Prussia would take over the reorganization of Germany. At the same time, Austria remained a great power, a deliberate decision by Bismarck to avoid future conflicts. For Germany, this war had far-reaching consequences. The old German Confederation was dissolved and replaced by the North German Confederation under the leadership of Prussia. This new confederation united the northern German states and formed the basis for the later founding of the Reich. The southern German states initially remained independent, but were closely connected to Prussia. The war also changed many things domestically. The military success strengthened Bismarck's position considerably. Many of his former critics in Parliament felt compelled to reconsider their stance. The conflict over the army reform was subsequently resolved by the so-called Indemnity Act, which legitimized Bismarck's actions. This practically ended the years-long constitutional conflict. The Austro-Prussian War of 1866 was thus a key event in the history of Europe. Within a few weeks, Germany's political order was fundamentally changed. Prussia rose to become the leading power, Austria lost its influence, and the path to German unity was a great deal closer. For Bismarck, this war was a masterpiece of political strategy. He had managed to bring about a conflict in a targeted manner, to conduct it successfully militarily, and then to shape it politically in such a way that it was advantageous in the long term. In doing so, he combined diplomacy, military planning, and political flair in a way that distinguished him from many other politicians of his time. But here, too, the ambivalence of his politics is evident. Success was based on war and power politics, not on democratic processes or voluntary agreement. The question of whether this path was justified remains controversial to this day. At the end of this chapter, Prussia stands as the undisputed leading power in northern Germany. Austria is out of the game, the political landscape has been reorganized, and Bismarck has taken another decisive step towards his great goal. But German unity has not yet been fully achieved, and the next conflict is already looming on the horizon. Chapter 9: The Path to German Unity. After the decisive victory in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, Otto von Bismarck had almost achieved his greatest goal to date, but only almost. Austria had been ousted from internal German affairs, and Prussia had established itself as the leading power. But Germany was still not completely united. In particular, the southern German states such as Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt continued to be outside direct Prussian control. The next step was therefore to integrate these states into a common German empire, without triggering unnecessary resistance or international conflicts. First, Bismarck created a new political order in the north, the North German Confederation. This union of the northern German states was much more than a loose alliance. It was a federal state with its own constitution, a common parliament, and a unified army. The Prussian king was at the top, while Bismarck took over the political leadership as federal chancellor. In doing so, he had created a functioning political system that could serve as the basis for a future united Germany. The North German Confederation was a decisive intermediate step. He showed that German unity under Prussian leadership could not only be possible, but also stable. At the same time, it offered Bismarck the opportunity to put his political ideas into practice and develop them further. Particularly important was the combination of monarchical leadership and limited parliamentary participation, a system that appealed to both conservative and moderately liberal forces. But the real challenge was in the south. Although the southern German states were culturally and linguistically closely linked to the north, they were politically reluctant to join Prussia. Many of its rulers feared for their independence, and there were also reservations among the population about a unit dominated by Prussia. In addition, there was the influence of France, which had no interest in a strong united Germany on its border. Bismarck was aware of these difficulties. That is why he did not rely on direct coercion, but on a long-term strategy. A central component of this strategy were so-called alliances of protection and defiance. These military agreements connected the southern German states with Prussia without formally integrating them into the North German Confederation. In the event of an attack, they committed to supporting each other. These alliances had a dual function. On the one hand, they strengthened Prussia's military position and created a de facto unity in the event of defense. On the other hand, they gradually accustomed the southern German states to closer cooperation with Prussia. Bismarck understood that political integration often takes time, and that it can be more effective to bring it about indirectly rather than to force it. Another important factor on the road to unity was public opinion. In many parts of Germany, the desire for national unity grew. The experience of past wars had shown that a joint approach could be successful. At the same time, national ideas spread through the press, education, and political discussions. Bismarck recognized that this mood could be a decisive lever. But instead of openly presenting himself as a representative of the national movement, he remained cautious. For him, national unity was not an end in itself, but a means of strengthening Prussia. He wanted to control the unification and steer it into orderly channels, not leave it to an unpredictable mass movement. The situation also remained tense in foreign policy. France under Emperor Napoleon III watched the developments in Germany with growing concern. A united Germany would have significantly changed the balance of power in Europe and weakened France. Bismarck knew that a conflict with France was likely sooner or later. At the same time, he recognized that such a conflict could also represent an opportunity. Because a common external enemy could create exactly what had been missing so far, the complete unification of Germany. If the southern German states were forced to fight together with Prussia due to an external threat, this would not only strengthen military cooperation, but also promote a sense of national solidarity. This consideration was a central part of Bismarck's strategy. He did not simply plan unity, but prepared the conditions for it. Every step, every decision was part of a larger plan aimed at making the agreement as smooth and permanent as possible. At the same time, he worked to consolidate the internal structures of the North German Confederation. The constitution, the administration, the military. All these elements were designed in such a way that they could later be easily transferred to a larger German Reich. Bismarck was already thinking in categories that went beyond the current state. Another important aspect was economic integration. The German Customs Union, an association of German states to promote trade, played a decisive role in this. It connected many German regions economically with each other and created common interests. The southern German states were also part of this system, which further strengthened their connection to the north. This economic interdependence created a kind of invisible unity that had not yet been fully implemented politically, but was already noticeable in people's everyday lives. Bismarck understood that economic interests often unite more strongly than political ideals, and he used this circumstance in a targeted manner. Despite all this progress, the situation remained fragile. The southern German states were still independent. France observed developments critically, and even within Germany there were different ideas about what unity should look like. Bismarck therefore had to continue to proceed cautiously and strategically. His strength once again lay in his patience. He knew that the right moment was crucial. A premature agreement would have provoked resistance and possibly led to international conflicts. Instead, he waited for an opportunity that would allow him to complete the unit under the most favorable conditions possible. This opportunity was to come soon. In retrospect, it can be said that the path to German unity was not a straightforward process, but the result of a complex strategy. Bismarck combined political, military, economic, and diplomatic measures to achieve his goal step by step. He was not only concerned with the whether, but above all with the how. He did not want a fragile entity based on uncertain foundations, but a stable empire that could hold its own in the long term. To do this, he was willing to invest time, take risks, and also take unconventional paths. At the end of this chapter, Germany is on the threshold of unity. The structures have been created, the alliances exist, and the conditions are in place. All that is missing is one last impulse, an event that will finally bring the different parts together. And it was precisely this event that was soon to follow, with effects that would reach far beyond Germany. Chapter 10, The Franco-German War, 1870-71. The decisive step towards the completion of German unity led through a conflict that was to shake Europe, the war between France and Prussia. For Otto von Bismarck, this war was not a coincidence, but the result of a long-term political development that he had prepared with great care. At the same time, it was a moment when all his skills, diplomatic skills, strategic thinking, and political instinct, were in full force. After the events of 1866, the balance of power in Europe had shifted noticeably. Prussia had risen to become the dominant force in northern Germany, while Austria had been ousted from internal German affairs. France, on the other hand, viewed this development with growing concern. Under Emperor Napoleon III, the country continued to see itself as the leading power in Europe, and a strong united Germany did not fit into the self-image. Bismarck was aware of these tensions. He knew that France was a decisive factor on the road to German unity. As long as France felt threatened, it would try to prevent or at least delay the agreement. At the same time, he recognized that a conflict with France could also be an opportunity. A joint war against an external opponent would bind the southern German states more closely to Prussia and promote national unity. The immediate cause of the conflict arose from a seemingly distant matter: the succession to the Spanish throne. After the Spanish king was deposed, Spain was looking for a new monarch. One candidate was a prince from the House of Hohenzollern, i.e., from the same dynasty as the Prussian king. For France, this was an alarming signal. The idea of being surrounded on two sides, in the east and in the south, by a ruler associated with Prussia appeared to be a threat. The French government reacted with diplomatic pressure. She demanded that the candidacy be withdrawn, and also a guarantee that no Hohenzollern would ascend the Spanish throne in the future. This demand was not only politically but also symbolically of great importance. It called into question the power and prestige of Prussia. In this tense situation, a meeting took place between the French ambassador and the Prussian King Wilhelm I in the spa town of Bad Ems. The talks were initially calm, but France was not satisfied with the result and demanded further concessions. The king politely but firmly refused. What followed is one of the most famous moments in Bismarck's political career, the so-called EMS dispatch. The report of the conversation was sent to Bismarck, who edited it and had it published in an abridged form. He formulated the text in such a way that it was perceived as a provocation in both France and Prussia. In France, the impression was created that the ambassador had been brusquely rejected, while in Prussia the impression was gained that the king had been put under pressure. Public opinion in both countries heated up quickly, and political pressure grew. Finally, in July 1870, France declared war on Prussia. For Bismarck, this was exactly the situation he had been working towards. Prussia now stood not as an aggressor, but as an attacked party. This was crucial, because it enabled him to win over the southern German states. Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse-Darmstadt entered the war on the side of Prussia, a decisive step towards national unity. Militarily, the war was characterized by the superiority of the German forces from the beginning. The Prussian army, reinforced by the troops of the southern German states, was well organized, modernly equipped, and strategically excellently led. Under the direction of General Helmuth von Moltke, the military operations were precisely planned and implemented. Once again, a decisive advantage was the use of modern technologies. The railway enabled a rapid deployment of troops, while the telegraph ensured efficient communication. These factors gave the German troops a considerable advantage over the French army, which acted less flexibly. The first major battles took place as early as August 1870. The German troops achieved quick successes and pushed back the French forces. The Battle of Sedan in September 1870 was particularly significant. Here the German troops succeeded in encircling the French army and defeating it decisively. Emperor Napoleon III was taken prisoner, an event that shook Europe. However, the war was not over with the capture of the emperor. In France, the Republic was proclaimed, and the resistance continued. The German troops continued to advance and finally besieged Paris. The siege lasted several months and led to great deprivation for the population of the city. While the military operations continued, Bismarck worked in the background on the political completion of his goal. The war had bound the southern German states closely to Prussia, but now it was a matter of making this connection permanent. In negotiations with the southern German princes, he succeeded in getting them to agree to join a joint German empire. On January 18, 1871, a historic event finally occurred. In the mirror gallery of the Palace of Versailles, the Prussian King Wilhelm I was proclaimed German Emperor. This act symbolized the completion of German unity, and at the same time the culmination of Bismarck's political work. The choice of Versailles as the location was deliberate. It was a sign of victory over France and underlined Germany's new position of power in Europe. At the same time, it showed how closely military success and political decisions were linked. The war officially ended in May 1871 with the Treaty of Frankfurt. France suffered considerable territorial losses, especially Alsace and Lorraine, as well as high reparation payments. These conditions secured a strong starting position for the new German Reich, but also left long-term tensions between the two countries. For Bismarck, the Franco-German War was the last and decisive step on the road to German unity. He had managed to unite the various German states under Prussian leadership and create a new empire that became one of the leading powers in Europe. But here, too, the ambivalence of his politics is evident. The success was based on war, skillful manipulation, and strategic calculation. The question of whether this path would have been necessary or avoidable remains the subject of historical discussion to this day. What is indisputable, however, is that Bismarck made history with this war. He had a goal that many thought was unattainable, and he implemented it with a mixture of patience, determination, and political skill. At the end of this chapter, there is a united Germany, a new empire born of conflict, diplomacy, and strategic thinking. But with the founding of this empire, a new phase also began, the challenge of holding this structure together and stabilizing it permanently. Chapter 11: Founding of the German Empire, 1871. With the proclamation of the German Empire in January 1871, Otto von Bismarck reached the peak of his political career. What had been prepared for years through wars, diplomacy, and strategic thinking now found its formal conclusion. Germany was no longer a patchwork of individual states, but a united nation-state under Prussian leadership. But the founding of the empire was much more than a symbolic act. It marked the beginning of a new political order, the design of which was just as demanding as its creation. The location of the imperial proclamation was deliberately chosen, the Palace of Versailles near Paris. While French territory was still occupied by German troops, a new empire was born in the magnificent Hall of Mirrors. On January 18, 1871, Wilhelm I was proclaimed German emperor. Surrounded by German princes, military, and political representatives, a picture was created that not only symbolized the unity of Germany, but also demonstrated its new position of power in Europe. The choice of this location was no coincidence. It was intended to underline the victory over France and at the same time send a signal: Germany was now a great power that Europe had to reckon with. For many contemporaries, this moment was a historic triumph, a long-awaited conclusion to a decades-long quest for national unity. But behind the solemn facade was a complex political reality. For the newly founded German Empire was not a unified central state, but a federal entity. It consisted of numerous individual states, kingdoms, grand duchies, duchies, and free cities, each with its own traditions, administrations, and interests. This diversity now had to be integrated into a common political system. Bismarck played a decisive role in this. As the first Reich Chancellor, he was largely responsible for the drafting of the imperial constitution. This constitution formed the foundation of the new state and at the same time reflected Bismarck's political ideas. It combined elements of monarchical rule with limited parliamentary participation, a system designed to ensure stability while controlling political tensions. At the head of the empire was the emperor, who was also king of Prussia. This personal union underlined Prussia's dominant position within the Reich. The emperor had far-reaching powers, especially in foreign policy and the military. He appointed the Reich Chancellor, who acted as head of government and reported directly to the emperor. The Reichstag, on the other hand, the elected parliament, had a say, especially in financial matters, but its power was limited. Bismarck deliberately wanted to prevent parliament from gaining too much influence. For him, political stability was more important than comprehensive democratic co-determination. He saw parliament as a necessary element, but not a dominant one. This structure reflected Bismarck's basic conviction: politics should be steered from above, through experienced leadership and clear hierarchies. At the same time, however, he realized that a modern state could not do completely without the participation of the population. Therefore, he created a system that combined both authority and limited participation. One of the greatest challenges after the founding of the Reich was the integration of the various German states. Although they were now part of a common empire, many differences remained. The southern German states, for example, retained their own armies in peacetime and certain special rights. Bismarck accepted these compromises so as not to jeopardize unity. The empire also had to be brought together economically. Although there was already a certain economic integration through the Zollverein, it was now a matter of creating a uniform economic system. Uniform laws, a common currency, and the expansion of infrastructure were decisive steps in this direction. At the same time, Germany's role in Europe changed fundamentally. The new empire was not only larger and stronger than the previous German states, but also politically self-confident. It emerged as a new great power, with its own interests and a growing influence on the European balance. For Bismarck, this meant a new task. While he had previously worked primarily towards the unification of Germany, it was now a matter of securing and stabilizing this empire. He was aware that the foundation alone was not enough. A state not only had to come into being, but also be able to exist. A central aspect was therefore foreign policy. Bismarck wanted to avoid the new Reich being surrounded by hostile powers. France, in particular, which did not accept the loss of Alsace-Lorraine, posed a potential danger. Bismarck's goal was to isolate France diplomatically while building stable relations with other great powers. But there were also numerous domestic challenges. The different interests of the individual states, the tensions between conservative and liberal forces, and social changes due to industrialization and population growth presented the Reich with complex tasks. Bismarck had to find a balance between control and adaptation, between stability and change. Another important point was the question of national identity. Although Germany was now politically united, this did not automatically mean that all people felt part of a common nation. Regional differences, cultural diversity, and historical traditions remained. Bismarck was aware that unity had to be consolidated not only politically, but also socially. Symbolism played an important role in this. National holidays, shared institutions, and a growing awareness of a shared history helped create a sense of belonging. At the same time, the challenge of maintaining the balance between unity and diversity remained. For Bismarck personally, the founding of the Reich was the highlight of his career, but it did not mean the end of his political activity. On the contrary, a new phase began in which he steered the fate of the German Empire as Reich Chancellor. His task was to secure and further develop what had been achieved. Looking back, it can be said that the founding of the German Empire was a historic turning point. It changed not only the political landscape of Germany, but also the power structure of Europe. A new state had emerged, shaped by the ideas, decisions, and strategies of one man. But as with many major historical events, a certain ambivalence remains. Unity was not achieved through democratic processes, but through wars and power politics. The structures of the empire were stable, but not necessarily just in the modern sense. These contradictions were to accompany the empire for a long time to come. At the end of this chapter, there is a united Germany, strong, self-confident, and full of opportunities, but also with challenges that have yet to be overcome. The foundation was a beginning, not a conclusion. And for Bismarck, it meant the transition from the phase of construction to the phase of securing, a task that was no less demanding than anything that had come before. Chapter 12: Bismarck's Domestic Policy. After the founding of the German Empire in 1871, Otto von Bismarck was faced with a new, no less demanding task: to stabilize the young empire internally. While he had previously worked mainly through wars and diplomacy, his focus now shifted to domestic politics. It became clear that Bismarck was not only a master of foreign policy, but also a skillful, albeit often controversial, domestic politician. The German Empire was a complex entity. It united different regions, cultures, religions, and political traditions. This diversity was a challenge, because it also brought tensions. Bismarck's goal was to secure the unity of the empire and at the same time control possible dangers to the state order. In doing so, he often acted decisively, sometimes even uncompromisingly. A central conflict in Bismarck's domestic policy was the so-called Kulturkampf. This was directed against the Catholic Church, which Bismarck regarded as a potential threat to state authority. The background was the concern that Catholic citizens could show their loyalty to the Pope rather than to the German state. Especially after the founding of the Catholic Centre Party, which gained increasing political influence, Bismarck saw a need for action. As part of the Kulturkampf, various measures were taken to limit the influence of the Church. These included laws that placed the training and appointment of priests under state control, as well as regulations that monitored church activities. The so-called pulpit paragraph, which restricted political statements by clergymen, was also part of this policy. These measures led to considerable tensions. Many Catholics felt restricted in their religious freedom, and resistance to Bismarck's policies grew. Instead of weakening the Church, the Kulturkampf paradoxically strengthened solidarity within the Catholic population. The Centre Party gained support and developed into an important political force. Bismarck finally realized that this conflict did not go in his favor in the long term. In the late 1870s, he began to relax and gradually withdraw his policy towards the Church. This change shows a typical feature of his policy. He was willing to adjust his strategy if it became apparent that a course did not lead to the desired success. Parallel to the Kulturkampf, Bismarck was confronted with another challenge: the rise of the workers' movement. As industrialization progressed, the number of factory workers grew, and with it the social problems. Long working hours, low wages, and insecure living conditions led to discontent and protests. In this environment, the socialist movement gained increasing influence. Organizations such as the Social Democratic Workers' Party, which later became the SPD, demanded fundamental changes in the political and economic system. For Bismarck, this posed a serious threat, as he saw socialist ideas as a danger to the existing order. His reaction to this development was twofold. On the one hand, he relied on repression. With the so-called anti-socialist laws, he tried to ban socialist organizations, meetings, and publications. The aim was to weaken the movement and limit its influence. On the other hand, Bismarck realized that pure suppression would not be enough. He understood that the social problems that fed socialism could not be ignored. For this reason, he developed a series of reforms that are considered the beginning of the modern welfare state. Between 1883 and 1889, Bismarck introduced several social laws, including health insurance, accident insurance, and old age and disability insurance. These measures were intended to improve the living conditions of the workers and at the same time strengthen their ties to the state. Bismarck hoped that social security would reduce the attractiveness of socialist ideas. This policy was innovative in many ways. For the first time, the state took an active role in the social security of its citizens. At the same time, however, the goal remained politically motivated. It was not only about aid, but also about control and stability. The combination of repression and reform clearly shows Bismarck's pragmatic approach. He was not an ideologue, but a politician who was willing to use different means to achieve his goals. In doing so, he was always concerned with securing the state and maintaining the existing order. Another important area of his domestic policy was dealing with political parties. The empire already had a certain degree of parliamentary participation, but Bismarck tried to limit the power of the Reichstag. He cleverly used changing majorities to push through his policies and played off different parties against each other. This was particularly evident in his cooperation with the National Liberals in the early years of the Reich. These supported many of his reforms, especially in the economic sphere. But as their interests diverged, Bismarck turned to other political forces. This flexibility allowed him to secure his position and avoid political deadlocks. Bismarck also set important accents in economic policy. In the early years of the empire, the economy was strongly influenced by liberal ideas, but later he changed course towards protectionist policies. With the introduction of protective tariffs, he wanted to protect German industry and agriculture from foreign competition. This measure was not without controversy, but it gave rise to new political alliances, especially with conservative and agrarian interests. Here, too, Bismarck's ability to adapt political strategies to changing conditions becomes apparent. Overall, Bismarck's domestic policy was characterized by the attempt to create a balance between progress and control, between reform and stability. He wanted to modernize the empire without endangering the existing order. In doing so, he often proceeded decisively, but was not afraid to correct mistakes and break new ground. His political actions were always guided by a central goal: securing the state. For Bismarck, the state was the highest good, to which all other interests had to be subordinated. This attitude determined his decisions and had a lasting influence on the development of the empire. But as so often in his career, a certain ambivalence remains. Many of his measures were successful and laid important foundations for the future. At the same time, they led to conflicts, restrictions, and tensions that weighed on the political climate. At the end of this chapter, Bismarck shows himself as a domestic politician in all his facets: determined, strategic, flexible, but also controversial. He was a man who was willing to break new ground to achieve his goals, with both progress and control in mind. The challenges he faced were complex, and many of them continue to have an impact today. Because the questions that Bismarck dealt with are still important today: how much influence should the state have? How do you deal with social inequalities? And how can political stability be ensured in a diverse society? These questions accompany history to this day, and make Bismarck's domestic policy an important chapter that reaches far beyond his own time. Chapter 13: Foreign Policy and the Alliance System. After the founding of the German Empire in 1871, Otto von Bismarck was faced with a completely new challenge. While the unification of Germany had previously been the focus of his policy, it was now a matter of securing this newly created empire permanently. Bismarck knew that the greatest enemy of a newly founded state could lie not only internally, but above all in the external environment. Europe was a complex network of great powers with competing interests, and Germany had made itself a central player with its creation. Bismarck's foreign policy goal was therefore clearly defined. He wanted to preserve peace in Europe in order to ensure the stability of the German Reich. Unlike in the phase of unification, he no longer pursued expansionist goals. For him, the empire was saturated, i.e., complete in its territorial development. Any further war would have endangered the painstakingly created balance and created new enemies. At the center of his strategy was the isolation of France. After the Franco-German War, relations between the two countries were severely strained. France had not only suffered a military defeat, but also lost territory and had to pay high reparations. Bismarck was aware that France would not accept this defeat permanently. A possible war of revenge was a real danger. To minimize this risk, Bismarck tried to isolate France diplomatically. His goal was to prevent France from finding allies who could support it in a future conflict. At the same time, he wanted to establish stable relations with the other great powers in order to create a balance that would make war unattractive. A first important step in this direction was the so-called Three Emperors Agreement of 1873. This alliance united the German Reich with Russia and Austria-Hungary, three monarchies that had a common interest in maintaining the existing order. The agreement was intended to reduce tensions between the powers and at the same time isolate France in foreign policy. But this alliance was fragile from the beginning. In particular, the interests of Russia and Austria-Hungary in the Balkans repeatedly led to conflicts. Bismarck recognized that it was difficult to keep both powers in a stable alliance in the long term. Nevertheless, he tried to act as a mediator and control the tensions. An example of this role was the Congress of Berlin in 1878. After a war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, the situation in the Balkans had escalated. Bismarck invited the major European powers to Berlin to find a diplomatic solution. He presented himself as an honest broker who did not want to assert his own interests, but wanted to create a balance. Although the Congress of Berlin brought temporary stabilization, it also left behind tensions, especially between Germany and Russia, which felt disadvantaged. Bismarck therefore had to find new ways to secure the balance in Europe. An important part of his policy became the so-called alliance system. This was a complex network of treaties and agreements aimed at integrating Germany into a stable structure of relations while separating potential adversaries. A central element of this system was the dual alliance with Austria-Hungary, which was concluded in 1879. This alliance was defensive and directed primarily against Russia. It ensured that Germany would not stand alone in the event of an attack. At the same time, it strengthened relations with Austria-Hungary, which now became a close ally. Later, this alliance was expanded by Italy's accession to the Triple Alliance. Italy was also interested in protecting itself against France and therefore sought proximity to Germany and Austria-Hungary. For Bismarck, this was a further step towards isolating France and stabilizing the European balance. But despite these alliances, Bismarck tried not to let relations with Russia break off completely. He knew that a conflict between Germany and Russia would be dangerous, especially if France were to ally itself with Russia. To prevent this, he concluded the so-called Reinsurance Treaty with Russia in 1887. This secret treaty ensured neutrality for both sides in the event of an attack by a third power, with certain exceptions. He was a typical example of Bismarck's flexible and often contradictory diplomacy. While Germany was officially allied with Austria-Hungary, it maintained a secret agreement with Russia. This dual strategy was risky, but effective. It showed Bismarck's ability to manage complex political situations and keep several options open. For him, diplomacy was not a rigid system, but a dynamic game in which you had to constantly react to changes. Another feature of his foreign policy was his deliberate restraint towards colonial ambitions. While other European powers acquired colonies in Africa and Asia, Bismarck was initially skeptical of such undertakings. He considered colonies to be economically insecure and politically risky. It was not until the 1880s that Germany began to become more involved in colonial competition, but more for domestic political reasons and under pressure from various interest groups. Bismarck himself remained cautious and tried to avoid conflicts with other powers. Overall, his foreign policy was characterized by a clear principle: balance. Bismarck wanted to prevent alliances from forming against Germany and at the same time ensure that no single state became too powerful. This balance was intended to secure peace and guarantee the German Reich a stable position in Europe. His strategy was remarkably successful. During his term in office, Europe remained largely free of major wars, despite numerous tensions. Bismarck succeeded in limiting conflicts, managing alliances, and integrating the new German Reich into the European system. But this system was heavily dependent on his personal ability. Bismarck himself was the central element that held the various relationships together. His experience, his knowledge of human nature, and his strategic thinking were decisive for the functioning of the alliance system. However, this was precisely a weakness. The system was complex and sometimes contradictory. Without Bismarck's leadership, there was a danger that it would fall apart. In fact, it would later become apparent that many of his diplomatic constructions were not permanently stable. Nevertheless, his foreign policy remains an impressive example of strategic thinking and diplomatic skill. He created a network of relationships that secured peace for years and gave the German Reich a strong position. At the end of this chapter, Bismarck stands as the architect of a European equilibrium based on caution, calculation, and political foresight. He had recognized that the greatest challenge after the agreement was not in the struggle, but in the preservation of what had been achieved. But how stable this balance really was would only become apparent in the years after his retirement from politics. Chapter 14: Dismissal and Final Years. After decades of political dominance, Otto von Bismarck's career was coming to an end, not by his own decision, however, but by a conflict that could hardly be avoided. The man who had created the German Reich and shaped it for years increasingly came into conflict with the new generation at the head of the state. This conflict finally culminated in his dismissal in 1890 and ushered in the last phase of his life. The turning point began with the change of government after the death of Kaiser Wilhelm I in 1888. He was initially succeeded by his son Frederick III, whose reign lasted only a few months. After his death, Wilhelm II ascended the throne, a young, ambitious emperor with his own ideas of politics and power. Wilhelm II was fundamentally different from his grandfather. While Wilhelm I had largely trusted Bismarck and left him great political leeway, the new Kaiser himself wanted to intervene more actively in the government. He strove to take over political leadership not only symbolically, but also in fact. This inevitably created a tense relationship between the experienced chancellor and the young monarch. Bismarck was already over 70 years old at that time, but he was by no means prepared to give up his power without a fight. He was used to controlling political decisions and determining the direction of politics. For him, the emperor was the head of state, but the practical implementation of the policy was in his hands. This self-image increasingly collided with the ideas of Wilhelm II. A central point of contention was domestic politics, especially how to deal with social democracy. Bismarck wanted to further intensify his repressive measures against the socialist movement and extend the existing anti-socialist laws. Wilhelm II, on the other hand, was more open to new approaches and wanted to take a less confrontational course. Differences also came to light in foreign policy. Over the years, Bismarck had built up a complex alliance system based on balance and stability. Wilhelm II, on the other hand, strove for a more active, self-confident role for Germany in the world, a policy that later became known as world politics. These different ideas led to growing mistrust. The conflict between the two men intensified. Bismarck tried to secure his position by using political alliances and bringing his experience into play. But Wilhelm II was determined to assert his authority. He did not want a chancellor who dominated politics, but one who carried out his instructions. In March 1890, the decision was finally made. After a series of disputes and failed attempts to find a compromise, Wilhelm II demanded Bismarck's resignation. On March 20, 1890, Bismarck handed in his dismissal, officially at his own request, but in fact under pressure from the Kaiser. This marked the end of a political era. For almost 3 decades, Bismarck had decisively determined the fate of Prussia and later the German Reich. His resignation not only marked the end of his personal career, but also a profound change in German politics. After his release, Bismarck retired to his country estate of Friedrichsruh. There he spent the last years of his life, far away from political power, but by no means without influence. He remained an important figure in the public eye, and his opinions continued to be closely followed. In his last years, he devoted himself primarily to writing his memoirs. This memoir, published under the title Thoughts and Memories, provides insight into his view of the political events of his time. However, they are not only a historical document, but also an attempt to justify his own actions and shape his legacy. Even after his retirement, Bismarck remained a critical observer of political developments. He was particularly skeptical about foreign policy under Wilhelm II. He warned against abandoning the alliance system he had created and leading Germany into unnecessary conflicts. In his eyes, there was a danger that the cautious balance he had built up could be destroyed by ill-considered decisions. However, his warnings were only heard to a limited extent. The new political leadership pursued its own goals and increasingly distanced itself from Bismarck's course. In particular, the non-renewal of the reinsurance treaty with Russia in 1890 is often cited as an example of how German foreign policy changed after his resignation. Despite his distance from active politics, Bismarck remained a respected personality. He was revered by many as the Iron Chancellor, the man who had united Germany and made it a great power. At the same time, there were also critical voices that questioned his policies and pointed out the dark sides of his decisions. Personally, Bismarck's last phase of life was marked by a certain dichotomy. On the one hand, he enjoyed the peace and quiet and the opportunity to withdraw from everyday political life. On the other hand, it was difficult for him to relinquish control and observe developments in the empire only from a distance. His health deteriorated increasingly during these years. The stresses of a long political life, combined with personal stress and health problems, left their mark. Nevertheless, he remained intellectually active and continued to follow political events with great interest. Otto von Bismarck died on July 30, 1898 at the age of 83 in Friedrichsruh. His death marked the end of the life of a man who had had a lasting impact on the history of Germany and Europe. His funeral became a national event that once again underlined the importance of his person. In retrospect, his dismissal appears to be a turning point, not only in his own life, but also in the history of the German Reich. With his withdrawal, the Reich lost a politician who had provided stability and balance for years. The policies of the following years were to show how difficult it was to maintain this balance without him. Bismarck's last years are therefore more than just a personal epilogue. They also shed light on the fragility of political systems and the importance of leaders. They show that even the most powerful politicians do not stay at the top forever, and that every political order evolves, often in unpredictable ways. At the end of this chapter is a man who had achieved everything he set out to do, and yet had to see the world go on without him. His life was marked by power, strategy, and success, but his last years are a reminder that even great careers come to an end. And it is precisely this ending that opens up a view of the last question. How is Bismarck remembered? What remains of his work, and how do we judge it today? These questions lead directly to the final chapter of his story. Chapter 15: Bismarck's Legacy. The death of Otto von Bismarck in 1898 marked the end of the life of a man who had shaped the history of Germany like no other. But while his personal influence was finally over, something new began at the same time: the confrontation with his legacy. To this day, Bismarck is assessed differently: as a brilliant statesman, as a cold power politician, as the architect of German unity, or as a symbol of authoritarian politics. It is precisely this complexity that makes him one of the most fascinating characters in history. Probably his greatest and indisputable success was the unification of Germany. Within a few years, he succeeded in transforming a politically fragmented area into a unified nation-state. This success was no coincidence, but the result of a clear strategy that combined military strength, diplomatic skill, and political calculation. Bismarck recognized early on that German unity could not be achieved through idealism alone, but through targeted power politics. His approach was characterized by realism. He was not guided by theoretical concepts or ideological ideas, but by the concrete circumstances of his time. For him, politics was not a place for wishful thinking, but a field in which decisions had to be made under pressure. This attitude made him successful, but also controversial, because the path to unity was accompanied by wars. The conflicts with Denmark, Austria, and France were central elements of his strategy. They ultimately led to the founding of the German Empire, but also cost many lives and permanently changed the European power structure. Critics therefore accuse him of deliberately relying on military force instead of seeking peaceful solutions. But Bismarck's legacy is not limited to unification. His domestic policy also left deep marks. Particularly noteworthy is the introduction of social laws, which are considered the basis of the modern welfare state. With health, accident, and pension insurance, he created a system that for the first time assumed state responsibility for social security. These reforms were far ahead of their time. They showed that Bismarck was not only interested in power politics, but also recognized the social changes of his era and reacted to them. At the same time, however, they were also politically motivated. They were intended to bind workers to the state and reduce the attractiveness of socialist ideas. Here, too, the typical mixture of progress and control that characterized his politics can be seen. Another important element of his legacy is his foreign policy. After the founding of the German Empire, Bismarck pursued the goal of securing peace in Europe and stabilizing the German Reich. His alliance system was designed to avoid conflict and maintain the balance of power. For many years, he succeeded in doing so, a remarkable achievement at a time marked by political tensions. But here, too, a certain ambivalence is evident. The system was complex and heavily dependent on his personal leadership. After his resignation, it began to fall apart, and many historians see this as one of the causes of the later conflicts in Europe. The question of whether Bismarck's policies were stable in the long term or only worked in the short term is still debated today. His attitude to democracy is also a central point in the evaluation of his work. Bismarck was not a democrat in the modern sense. He saw political participation more as a means to an end and tried to limit the power of parliament. For him, the stability of the state took precedence over the expansion of democratic rights. This attitude led to tensions that shaped the political system of the empire. Although there was an elected parliament, the decisive positions of power remained with the emperor and the government. This imbalance was to lead to problems later on, and is often considered one of the weaknesses of the empire. Despite this criticism, Bismarck remains an outstanding figure in history. His ability to analyze complex political situations and act strategically is still impressive today. He knew how to recognize opportunities and use them consistently. In doing so, he was willing to take risks and take unconventional paths. His influence extends far beyond his own time. Many of the structures he created continued to have an effect long after his death. The German Reich, as he had shaped it, existed until the end of the First World War. The social security systems he introduced were also further developed and still form an important part of modern states today. But just as important as his successes are the questions that his work raises. How much power should a single politician have? Is it justified to pursue political goals by military means? And how can a balance be found between stability and freedom? These questions make Bismarck a figure who is not only historically interesting, but also remains relevant to the present. His politics do not offer easy answers, but challenge us to take different perspectives and think critically. For a long time, Bismarck was celebrated in the public perception above all as a national hero. Monuments were erected, streets and squares were named after him, and his image shaped the collective memory. Especially in the German Empire and even later, it was portrayed as a symbol of strength, unity, and political determination. But over time, this picture has changed. Historians and the public began to take a more differentiated view of his work. In addition to the successes, the problematic aspects also came more into focus. Today, Bismarck is no longer seen as a hero, but as a complex personality whose actions are both admired and critically questioned. This differentiated view is a sign of how our understanding of history is changing. It's no longer just about celebrating great personalities, but also about analyzing their decisions and understanding their impact. In the end, Bismarck remains a figure full of contradictions. He was a man of progress and control, an architect of unity and an opponent of comprehensive democracy, a diplomat and a power politician at the same time. It is precisely these contrasts that make it so interesting, and so difficult to evaluate unambiguously. His legacy is therefore not only the German Reich or the institutions he created, but also the discussion about power, politics, and responsibility. It shows how much a single person can achieve, and at the same time how complex the consequences of political action are. This closes the circle. From the early years of a young man in the Prussian nobility to the formative figure of an entire era, a story spans far beyond a single person. Bismarck made history, but how we evaluate this history is up to us.